over the last 50 years, I think it's safe to say that the dismissal has been discussed more than enough. There's no new revelation or perspective that I can provide on it. But looking back on the 50th anniversary of Gough Whitlam's sacking, more than anything, it kind of fills me with a sense of really just despair at the low level that Australian politics did sink to and how that failed the democratic institutions of this country. If by some miracle you didn't learn about the dismissal in Year 9 history, like every other person in this country, the dismissal in Australia refers to the pinnacle of the 1975 constitutional crisis in this country, where the Labor Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, was dismissed by the Governor-General, John Kerr. And if you are any more unaware of the system, the Governor-General in Australia is the representative of the monarch in the country, and all constitutional powers afforded to the monarch are given in writing in the Constitution to the Governor-General. The Governor-General alone has the power to use these a whole swathe of emergency powers in the Constitution if needed. The best way I've heard it described is that the Governor-General is a fire extinguisher for when the constitution or the political system in this country is burning down. A very simple summary of the events, and this is just going to be looking at what we all completely agree on: considerations relating to the United States involvement in the CIA. I will touch on it at the end, but for the time being, this is the official narrative that we have. So in 1972, after more than 2 decades in opposition, the Australian Labor Party under Gough Whitlam returned to power, and they oversaw a massive series of reforms within the country. We're talking about the introduction of Medibank, the precursor to Medicare, the introduction of free university attendance for all Australians. It was an incredible government that achieved a lot, and probably, I think it is fair to say, Whitlam himself is very much regarded as one of, if not the greatest leaders in the history of the labour movement. But as much as he is a hero to many, myself included, Gough did make some mistakes that damaged his credibility and standing with the Australian public. Most famously, the loans affair and trying to get billions of dollars from a very sketchy financier in the Middle East who was, I think, also an arms dealer, which raised concerns there. Some controversies around trying to appoint opposition party members to roles as a high commissioner. And then this is entirely outside of Gough's control, but just like the oil crisis of the 1970s and looking at, I think domestic inflation in Australia got up to 18% during Gough Whitlam's time in power. So there was legitimate criticism, and of course something's out of his control that did affect his popularity in Australia. Oh, and on top of that, I should also stress, second part of the loans affair, the fact that they knowingly lied to Parliament about that. So yeah, quite a couple of controversies were wrapping up around Whitlam during his time in office. And the Conservative opposition saw that as an opportunity to play the game of politics in a fantastically shithouse way. Now, Whitlam actually won 2 terms in office. He won in 1972, and then there was an early election 2 years later in 1974, which Whitlam again won, but the thorn in Whitlam's side had always been the Senate. His control there was never comparable to what the Labor Party had in the lower house. And that really hit a boiling point when Conservative premiers in Australia started using that specifically to their advantage to try and derail the Whitlam government. You guys will be familiar with the infamous incident of what happened when a Queensland senator for the Labor Party died in office. His replacement, as opposed to what was like convention at the time of somebody being appointed with the approval of whatever party that senator had been from, Joe Peterson, the then Nationals Premier of Queensland, decided he was going to appoint someone who was just like, yes, a member of the Labor Party, but somebody who was a massive critic of Gough Whitlam and would oppose him. And then after another Labor senator was appointed to the High Court, his replacement, a different Conservative Premier, I believe from New South Wales, appointed an independent in his place. So the Labour Party had lost 2 senators, and in exchange, Conservative premiers had just sent people that were not aligned with them to replace those senators. So the situation was essentially complete deadlock in the Senate. The coalition, with its newfound ability to block any legislation, being the largest group in the Senate now, basically went nuclear and said they would not allow the passage of any bill to supply the government, basically provide funding for the government, unless Whitlam called a general election. And the reason they wanted that was, well, Whitlam, like I mentioned before, had a lot of scandals. He was not doing particularly well. The entirety of the media apparatus was against him at this point, and it was very clear to everybody that if Whitlam called an election, well, he would lose, and bad. Whitlam's solution to this deadlock was to try and call a half Senate election. Basically, just cross your fingers and hope that if you put half of the Senate up for election, that there is a chance that the Labour Party would be able to get its majority back. But considering the polling, that was incredibly unlikely, but it was what Gough saw as the best possible option to keep Labour in power and potentially break the deadlock. Now, aside from the fact that Labour would almost certainly go backwards in the Senate if they tried to pull this off, is that to get an election for the half Senate together and hold it would mean that the government would essentially run out of money, because that election process, getting the whole thing organised, collecting the writs and actually finalising the results, could take weeks to months, at which point the government would run out of money because the coalition in the Senate still hadn't approved any supply bills. By convention, when a Prime Minister requests an election from the Governor-General, he normally does so with like the express statement that he has secured supply for the government during the period of this election, so that there won't be some interim period during the election process where the government suddenly runs out of money. So that was actually quite unprecedented from Whitlam to go to the Governor-General and say, I want a half Senate election, but breaking with tradition, I can't actually guarantee you that I have the supply to keep the government functioning in the meantime. This, according to all the stories we have, is what convinced John Kerr that he had to do what he did. When Gough Whitlam came to him and said that he was going to call a half Senate election, or was rather requesting one from John Kerr, but that he didn't have any supply to guarantee that the government would continue functioning during that half Senate election, Kerr informed Whitlam that he was now dismissed as Prime Minister. This is where some of the really morally grey areas start to come out. Because what John Kerr had been doing was behind Gough Whitlam's back, behind the Prime Minister's back, the man who, according to all precedent, he's supposed to be the confidant of, and somebody that he works with. He had gone behind Whitlam's back, had met with Malcolm Fraser, the leader of the Liberal Party, the leader of the opposition, and said, to solve this crisis, I have a proposal for you. I will make you a caretaker Prime Minister if you do 3 things. First of all, you fund the government. You go to your colleagues in the Senate, you have them pass one of the supply bills, and you ensure that the government doesn't run out of money. 2, you don't do anything that relates to policy. No changing of regulations, no flexing of executive power. You don't do anything. Except for condition number 3. What you do as Prime Minister is immediately call an election so we can resolve this issue. So here's Kerr's full rationale for how he was approaching the situation. You have this deadlock situation where the Liberal Party is playing bullshit politics to try and stop the government from funding itself. You have 2 men, Whitlam and Fraser, who are not going to budge over this. And the only way that he sees to ensure that the government gets supply and is still funded is to dismiss Whitlam and have an election called. I can't stress how much I disagree with that line of thinking. Because I guess something in Kerr's favour is that I can understand why he was so panicked. Because from what we understand from Gough Whitlam's perspective on everything, he was planning to run the government as long as it would take to get the Liberals to break. Hell of a rhyme there. but this is not a happy topic. His perspective, as we understand it, Whitlam's that is that somehow the Australian people would blame the Liberals for this whole situation and not his government, that a half-cent election might work for him, and that if that wasn't the case, he would just keep going and keep governing until the Liberals budge, no matter how long the government didn't have supply. That situation, as deemed by Kerr, where defence personnel, all government employees, the very functioning of the state, everything stops getting paid and stops working, he deemed necessary to overrule Whitlam's democratic right to governance, which is not something that I think I can ever agree with. Whitlam had a democratic mandate. He was re-elected in 1974. He still had a majority in the lower house. And as far as I can tell, he had every right to continue governing the way that he did, even if it meant he didn't have supply. The Australian people elected him, and in spite of the fact that it would have been unprecedented and incredibly disastrous, I still believe, genuinely, that the damage caused by dismissing an elected leader like that was greater than the economic turmoil that would have come if the government had functioned without supply for months. Now, of course, in the ensuing election that was eventually called for 1975, Whitlam got destroyed doesn't really put it right. He was eviscerated by Malcolm Fraser in that election. It is, in the history of modern politics, the most disproportionate beatdown we have ever seen, the biggest landslide in modern Australian political history. And some people will use that just as a justification for why the dismissal wasn't that bad. Of course, because, look, Kerr, part of his conditions was that when Fraser gets in, that we have an election to validate this decision, as it were. And yes, okay, you can respect that, but just because a government is polling poorly and is clearly going to lose an election, last time I checked, that doesn't invalidate the right of a party to govern for the term that it wins. At least that's my 2 cents on it. Now, here's something I've got to address. And I've noticed that in discussions about the dismissal and about Whitlam, that over the last couple of years, the notion of the Americans being involved by the CIA has become a lot more mainstream and accepted, if not as fact, as kind of like the implied nudge nudge. We all know they probably played some role in it. And while it's not something that I think we can look at with complete certainty, I've always been open to that possibility just because of how unsurprising it would be if it was ever revealed to be the case. I mean, Gough Whitlam, a politically revolutionary leader, bringing in a proper left-wing government in Australia, coming in and also being very antagonistic towards the Americans, wanting to shut down Pine Gap and the degree to which Australian and American defence institutions were incorporated with one another. The Americans have reacted for a lot less in other parts of the world when countries move like that. So the idea that they would do something like that here, in a country where the Governor-General just so happened to be a man who had a very strong working relationship with a lot of Americans, I don't think it's something that can just be written off, and it's something that I will always be open to discussing. That is my one conspiracy theory that I get to have. But anyway, I digress. The main point is, the dismissal was a profoundly traumatic moment in Australian history, and it's one that I don't look back on with any particular fondness, and I don't think many Australians should, because it was an instance where the institutions in this country decided, or rather one man representing those institutions decided, that the stability of the country was more important than democratic norms. And look, it's not good business in the YouTube world to point people up to other channels, I suppose, but one thing that I do think is important is that I've rushed through a lot of the dismissal just to get to the end point of expressing my political opinion on it, so I highly recommend you guys do go and learn more about the specifics and the intricacies of the dismissal. The Constitutional Clarion is a fantastic resource for this. She even interviewed the current Governor General to talk about the dismissal and the constitutional crisis, and I highly recommend that you guys go check that out. Look, at the end of the day, the thing I find most upsetting about the dismissal is that Labor's last truly great left-wing Prime Minister, as I'll call him, Gough Whitlam, came to power with a promise to make life better for as many Australians as possible. And he kept those promises and delivered on them. And I can't help but think that part of the Labor Party's gradual decades-long shift away from leaders like him is the fact that their last truly great left-wing leader was kicked out of office in such a traumatic way. I don't know if modern Australia deserves another man like Gough, but God help us, and I will always pray that one day we see a Prime Minister and a leader of this country like that man again.